Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets are in training camp and thinking about the preseason and regular season ahead. Should Cam Thomas enter into the conversation to be in the starting five? We break down the possibilities with a 100% Ben Simmons at the point guard helm coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets. Every single day, I am Adam Armbrecht, breaking down not only the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack, but also your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast with Danny McDonough. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And remind you that with Jace Medical, you can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using promo code Locked On at checkout at jacemedical.com. And where we begin to remind you about the Brooklyn Nets in the upcoming season is the potential of what the combinations can look like in the starting unit and into the second unit. Over the course of this offseason, in recent weeks, we've had conversations around some nice odds. Cam Thomas, 6th Man of the Year award, Defensive Player of the Year for Nicholas Claxton. We've also had the news updates around one Ben Simmons, something that we'll talk more at the back end of this week. But the cliff notes of that is that Jock has caught and other good details just around their relationship, something that we mentioned over these last couple of interviews with Ben Simmons, that he's 100%. That he'll be playing with no restrictions, that he's good to go. So we can now safely assume that he will be the starting point guard without limitations going into the regular season. And it got me back to this Cam Thomas thought. Should he be in the starting lineup opening night for the Brooklyn Nets? And the short answer for me is yes. And there's a lot of different reasons why on both sides of this. And we'll take a look at the trickle-down effect into the second unit, the lineups, and really what the other possibilities could be. Spencer Dinwiddie being chief among them. But if you look at this from a high level, that the Brooklyn Nets drafted Cam Thomas in the first round of the NBA draft, one of their 2 first-round picks, along with Daron Sharp that year. And these are guys that even at the time, whether or not you viewed them in a different role or what your expectations were in the short term, when you had the superstars in Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden, it was comfortable to believe that you could take guys that would need a couple of years to fully develop and to become the players that you think could be contributors in the short term behind the superstar or represent the long term and the post-superstar era potentially and be a part of the core going forward. And both these players, in Cam Thomas and Daron Sharp, have had different paths. We understand and know and have discussed the way the fan base has reacted to the use or lack thereof for Cam Thomas, especially last season after the trade. As we've highlighted before, the stats Cam Thomas, the growth from year 1 to year 2, specifically when it came to his perimeter shooting, specifically when we think about the overall skill set that he brings, it's not hard to look at this lineup, to look at this roster and say, he very well could, maybe should be in the starting rotation. And for me, the safety valve of all this is having Spencer Dinwiddie on the roster. And we'll talk a little bit about the age and the veterans and what that means inside of these groups and whether or not the Nets philosophically have brought the right approach to this upcoming season. But you can always take Spencer Dinwiddie in and out of the starting unit. He's 30 years old. He's on an expiring contract. He represents, yes, an experienced player that we've talked about previously who has had high-level production as a supporting cast member behind a Luka Doncic in Dallas. Is it going to be the same level of play ahead of him for the Brooklyn Nets coming season? Can Ben Simmons be a factor in that? Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson? Yeah, of course. But Spencer Dinwiddie has the both and. He's been a starter. He's been a bench player. He's been a 6th man. And I think you could very fluidly move him in and out of that. And while you could sit here and say, well, Cam Thomas needs to earn this season and earn it and show it, that's obvious. The world where Cam Thomas does not look right in camp or isn't blending in with certain units combinations. Yeah, I'm not saying no matter what, you start him day one, game one of this upcoming year. But if it looks like he's taking that next step forward in his progression, which does come down to team basketball, right? Being ready, able, and willing to move the ball out of your hand and not slow down the offensive process, and also the defensive end, which we'll get into. If he shows the next incremental growth, why wouldn't you take the opportunity of unlocking a different level of offensive game for this team in your best unit? And again, there's reasons we can debate if it's smart or if it should be or what it could be or based on the veterans on this roster, which we will. But there is no way that you objectively look at what Cam Thomas has put on tape over the first 2 years of his career and what the Nets lack inside of their starting unit. Even with Ben Simmons, who can be at the basket, attacking downhill, putting pressure on that defense, right? The gravity of awareness of players that are going to maybe kind of shrink down into the paint and then open up these kick out opportunities. That's fantastic. And Cam Thomas has shown that he can be the perimeter guy for you on the catch and shoot. We'll get into those numbers. But Cam Thomas is also a guy that gets at the basket himself. He is a guy that from day one coming into the league showed that he was physically ready to take on the body blows going at the rim, to finish at the rim, and to draw fouls at an incredibly high level and convert them at the line with next level efficiency, right? With high level efficiency. So for all these reasons, I think we take a look at Cam Thomas and we say, let's put him into the starting lineup. The other side of that coin, which we'll get into here coming up in a second, is if you put Cam Thomas in the starting lineup, what does the second unit look like? Where would his offensive value be in that second unit? And where do we think that they'll be constructing this crossover into some of the veteran players they have on this roster, like Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith, into the young players that they've brought in, like a Dennis Smith Jr., like a Lonnie Walker, and then the flyer guys, right? The Trendon Watfords and Darius Baisleys of the world. Even Jay Wilson, by the way, right? So all these other factors that are happening here. But I'm looking at this from a high level down. How do I put the best offensive unit out on the court so that I can hopefully have my team and this high level defense we think they're going to bring anchor us to victories? But you need to have that explosive, dynamic offensive play. And I believe that maybe Cam Thomas is that answer, and that Spencer Dinwiddie can help serve a different and certainly important role in that second unit as well. We'll unfold what the rest of these rotations would look like with Cam Thomas in the starting five coming up here in just 1 second. But before we do that, got to tell you about our friends over at Jace Case. They are, of course, the title sponsor of the show. You've heard Doug talk about it before. You know that whether it's storms, power outages, pandemics that we've gone through here, you want to be able to rely on having the access to life-saving medications and prescriptions that you don't have to worry about trying to get to your doctor, trying to get in to see your physician. Sometimes emergencies come up and you want to be able to have the ability to say that I have those things on hand for myself. I personally, you've heard Doug talk about his family and having 2 young years. I have a young niece and 2 young nephews. And the ability to say that I'm prepared just in case something were to come up while we're together and I'm responsible for them and I want them to be safe and healthy. That's what Jace Medical does for you by providing 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. And all it takes to get a Jace case is to fill out a simple online form. And in some cases, jump on a quick call with one of the board-certified physicians. You get ongoing care from their physicians on any treatment-related questions. Doctor created, doctor recommended as well. And Jace Medical is simple. As we say, you fill out that form, you have that access to the physicians as well, and it gives you peace of mind that you are not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Case Medical makes sure that you have medication in hand. You can also get $20 off on these life-saving antibiotics today from Jace Case Medical by using the promo code LOCKED on at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. Get $20 off on these life-saving antibiotics from Jace Medical by using code LOCKED on at checkout at jacemedical.com. Okay, so if the premise is that we're moving into a Cam Thomas starting era, Here's the philosophical problem that the Brooklyn Nets have presented to us. Dorian Finney-Smith is still on this roster. Royce O'Neal is still on this roster. Spencer Dinwiddie is still on this roster. So we understand, and I understand, that the idea of going to this youth, something that Doug and I have talked about over the course of this offseason, even going back to last season, and the post-trade era. The biggest issue that you run into is that the Nets are communicating to you that this win now mentality is going to maybe push you in the direction of more veteran play as opposed to youth. Now, I mentioned there in the first segment, we're talking about guys like Trendon Watford, Darius Bazley, right? Some of the players that the Brooklyn Nets are taking flyers on. If one of them bubbles up into the rotation, that's great. If one of them proves that beyond this season, they could be a part of maybe the long term for the Nets, that's excellent. I mentioned Jalen Wilson there as well in the previous segment. We understand that he's a player that is on the two-way contract and that there's at least some opportunity that he's going to be able to carve a role for himself when you're eligible for up to 50 games. Now, will that come early in the season? Unlikely. Could it come in the second half of the year, depending on how things go? Sure. And I can make the case that even if they're playing well, you still want to get some of these guys up here for this sample size, especially younger players or rookie draft picks. In the case of a Jalen Wilson, a guy that was an old rookie coming out, right? So you need to know what you have in him sooner than later, and we get into that on another day. But when we look at the depth chart and we suggest that Cam Thomas should be in the starting rotation, I suggest it. Doug's not here. Matter of fact, if you go over, you can see how Doug made the case why Spencer Dinwiddie should be a member of that starting unit along with Ben Simmons, along with Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and Nick Claxton. Some of the debate is whether or not is Dorian Finney-Smith going to be in this starting rotation. Well, once Ben Simmons is healthy and you start to push guys out, it really becomes, at least for me, very hard to find a world where he ends up being in there. Now, I guess the other side of this coin, we could say, is Ben Simmons is the starting point guard, and you put Mikal Bridges at the 2, at least from a labeling standpoint, and then it's Cameron Johnson at the 3. You could say Dorian Finney-Smith still at the 4, and then Nick Claxton at the 5. This is another version of the lineup. But in that instance, you're taking Spencer Dinwiddie out of the starting rotation. You're taking, if we're thinking about Cam Thomas, out of that starting rotation, and you really have a trickle-down effect. I think everyone would agree that while Dorian Finney-Smith is an experienced veteran, he also maybe suffers from some of the being taken out of the Luka Doncic world and being put into a team that does not have a superstar of that caliber, as excited as we are for Mikal Bridges. It shifts what he's going to be, right? It shifts what his role is. And this is where, again, if we all agree that Dorian Finney-Smith at 30 years old inside of this system with the other players, he has a role, but it's not going to be a starting role. I think Spencer Dinwiddie needs to fall into that category because then if we look at the second unit, let's say that we have Ben Simmons, Cam Thomas, just at the first high level of them playing together. Doug and I have talked about how Ben Simmons is really well suited to help unlock a player like Cam Thomas because you're going to have to be off ball, ready and waiting, as Ben Simmons has those drives in the lane, and Simmons has shown in the past that point guard talent, that point guard ability with all of that size. So you need to be ready to be that benefactor. And one of the things that's been brought up is the three-point shooting. And we know that Spencer Dinwiddie was not the same player in Dallas that he was in Brooklyn coming back. Really hasn't been the same player anywhere other than that stint with Dallas from a three-point shooting perspective. Now, he also, though, is very good on catch and shoot, or at least dramatically better on catch and shoot than he is in any other form. 31%, we talked about 31% outside of the stint with Dallas overall, but rising up over the last 3 seasons to knock down nearly 38% on catch and shoot threes. Now, Cam Thomas, though, to counterpoint it, has knocked down nearly 41% in a limited sample size on his catch and shoot threes, and that's primarily off of what he accomplished last year. So there are a lot of these one-to-one things that we look at when we talk about these two players and who should be in there or not. I also think that it alleviates some of the pressure on a Mikal Bridges, on a Cameron Johnson coming into this season. Mikal Bridges' usage and volume is going to be there. Can you make a case that putting Cam Thomas into the first unit diminishes how much his usage could be if you had him in the second unit and just let him be an offensive dynamo? Yes. But I want to have a similar process for my offense. I don't want to go to a Cam Thomas driven second unit where everyone is left standing around. Because even though we look at these other players like Dennis Smith Jr., Lonnie Walker, veterans like Royce O'Neal, and say, well, they're not the same players that we have in our start five, and they're not the most critical, and they're maybe not the most offensive talented. That's okay. But I cannot perpetuate the bad development of Cam Thomas, sending him out there to be an ISO ball dominant player when I need him in the big picture to become a team-oriented guy that when called upon can take over a game, also understands how to function inside the offensive system. That's why I push for him to be in the starting five. Look to the second unit and why I think Spencer Dinwiddie has value there. So Dennis Smith Jr., as we know, is going to have this role, and we think going to be certainly of a certain significance or size based on the fact that he took less money and, agreements were made, so to speak, with the Nets about what his role would be coming over. But Dennis Smith Jr. is 6'2", and he plays well above his size when we think about the defensive value that he brings in versatility. But if I'm going to talk about, and this isn't one-to-one, we know that it's fluid between the first and second unit. You don't do, a 5-man swap at a certain point, 8 minutes into the first quarter. You don't say, all right, all 5 out, all 5 in. But Cam Thomas is 6'3". So now you're talking about in that second unit having a very small, undersized backcourt. And for as good as Dennis Smith Jr. is, this could come down to the, all right, targeted switches on the defensive end. And Spencer Dinwiddie, while not necessarily being a defensive stalwart by any stretch of the imagination, he does represent a player that is standing at 6'6" and 215 pounds. So if I put him into the backcourt with Dennis Smith Jr., I now feel like even on those switching matchups, at least the size is not going to get absolutely picked apart. Because Cam Thomas is going to be undersized in some of these battles, even if it is a backcourt player. But now if you start getting switched up or if you start getting switched onto larger two guards, it's going to create issues for the Nets defensively. And this is true no matter what. You're not a whole free roster. We said this going back to the idea of the depth at the two guard spot for the Nets behind Mikal Bridges could be a problem. It definitely can be. But I need to find a way to make quality use that can function and play together and be consistent. So now I can look at Spencer Dinwiddie and his on-ball ability. This would be the counterpoint. It's not as strong as what Cam Thomas would bring to the second unit. But I also can have Lonnie Walker mixed in there. I can also have Royce O'Neal with his perimeter shooting. I can also think about how is it going to look if we start to get into, we don't know yet, but is a Trendon Watford, is a Darius Bazley going to provide value there in that second unit? What is Ron Sharp going to be here for this team? Looks like he's slimmed down. Is his role in his perimeter game going to evolve? The reality that when you look at this second unit, you say, without Cam Thomas in it, is it going to be able to function or sustain offensively? Probably not. Is Spencer Dinwiddie less effective offensive weapon, ball dominant, ISO guy than Cam Thomas? Yes, he probably is. But that's just the reality of this roster, right? So I'm talking about how do I make the best, most offensively fire-powered unit that I then, yes, need to lean my hat on the defensive side of it. I need to be able to lock down in that unit, frustrate the opposition, because I know that unto itself, even a lineup of Spencer Dinwiddie, Ben Simmons, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and Nicholas Claxton, you can go toe-to-toe with a lot of teams, but you could still find yourself on the losing end of it. So I want to find a way to push those margins. And coming up here in a second, we'll take a look at what the blend can be. And this year is almost regardless of Spencer Dinwiddie or Cam Thomas. How do we make multiple units that can be effective? Who are some of the first guys that come in off the bench, like a Spencer Dinwiddie, like a Dennis Smith Jr.? Where does Lonnie Walker fit in? And how do we think about some of these stars coming out, maybe including Cam Thomas, and moving into a second unit that has real playmaking ability and defensive value so we are a balanced team? Balanced team is what we're going for here, and we'll continue that part of the conversation in just one moment. So I mentioned a couple of the numbers there when we think about Cam Thomas and we think about Spencer Dinwiddie. I'm going to, again, just drill home the point here because I didn't bring up about Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith in the second unit. We're going to talk about them here. But they again exist inside of this group, along with Spencer Dinwiddie, of 30-plus year guys, of guys that we know what they are. We know where their value is. And I just regret living in the world where we're going to this season talking about these guys and what they're going to be. It's not a knock on any one of them. Royce O'Neal was phenomenal. We wouldn't have given up a first-round pick maybe for him, but he still has performed admirably. And he had a very different role pre- and post-trade and still performed very well, right? Taken from the starting five and moved to the bench. Dorian Finney-Smith is maybe a little more defensively versatile than I've given him credit for. But we also understand he's a team-friendly contract. He's not a part of the long-term future. And in the world where we could have gotten any number of draft capital, whether it was the highest first-round values or otherwise, we all agreed, or at least Doug and I agreed, those are moves that should have been made already. If not at the last year's trade deadline, then in the offseason. If not in the offseason, then at the draft. Again, and on down the line we go, and then we'll see how things unfold throughout the course of this regular season. But when we think about the starting to second unit, this is where I think it does become fascinating. Because if you're going to lean veteran heavy, then we can tell you that the top 8 for this team in no particular order is going to be Ben Simmons, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Nicholas Claxton, Spencer Dinwiddie, and then you're going to get into what? Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, and Cam Thomas. There's your top 8. Okay, it could be. But then why is Dennis Smith Jr. here, right? Why is Lonnie Walker here? There has to be a mentality or thought process from the Brooklyn Nets that we didn't move these guys ahead of schedule last season or early in this offseason because we wanted to make sure put placements in the pipeline and in place. But Dennis Smith Jr. represents the same value offensively that Ben Simmons does, minus the size, obviously. But he's an orchestrator, right? He's not a shooter. He's a downhill attacker. He can get at the basket efficiently. He can draw fouls. He's going to be better at the line than Ben Simmons is. But he's a guy who wants to set the table for others. So that's the number one redundancy. That's why we go back to put Cam Thomas next to Ben Simmons, let him play off ball, let him be productive, let him find those moments when that ball gets kicked out to him on the outside. Yes, we believe in his three-point shooting and how it's come along now, and he can also attack and get at the basket. Likewise for Spencer Dinwiddie, put him whichever way you want. In the second unit, same process though. Spencer Dinwiddie can be ready to go, standing on the perimeter, a 30-year-old veteran player to knock down the catch and shoot threes. I want to see these young players get into these opportunities. Dorian Finney-Smith, he is experienced, he is talent, he is quality. But do I want him to be taking away from a rotation that wants to bring in a guy like, I'm using these Trendon Watford, Darius Bailey, somebody has to claim a role here over the course of training camp in the preseason, like a Jalen Wilson if they're going to bring him up. I don't want them standing in the way of young progress. So I think you can find a way, though, to blend these accurately. If it's going to be a Royce O'Neal, I already said, going back to last week, there's an opportunity for the Nets to say, well, we know we've used him in the backcourt before, so he can serve that role. We know he can shoot from the outside with consistency. He doesn't have the on-ball capabilities. Is that enough to validate him? Not if I think that Cam Thomas is ready to take a step forward. Not if I believe that Dennis Smith Jr. has a role. Not if I believe that Lonnie Walker has some role here, right? That backcourt gets congested very quickly. As you move up it, though, Dorian Finney-Smith coming in first off the bench for Cam Johnson, that can make a lot of sense. And maybe Royce O'Neal in a small ball lineup. We talked a lot about that. When Claxton comes out, is it automatically Day'Ron Sharpe? Or again, do we think about an even further version of these small ball lineups where Dorian Finney-Smith comes into the 5? And now you go back into the 4 and you say, is it one of these young players that we brought in and can claim a role for themselves? Is it a Royce O'Neal? Do we leave a blended version of this where Cam Johnson stays out there with, as you go into the second unit, Mikal Bridges comes off? Now, when you go in and you think about, well, I have Dennis Smith Jr., still a table setter for Mikal Bridges, and then you put a Spencer Dinwiddie there with him, still a guy that can catch and shoot, still a guy that has familiarity, right? And this is what I think is the most important thing this offseason for the Nets, is to figure out the different combinations that work. Don't get locked into this idea that it needs to be a particular starting 5 based on stature, based on age, based on veteran status. No. Don't get locked into the idea that Cam Thomas only serves the function as an ISO on-ball dominant guard second unit. We don't want that to be the case. And when you go over and look at some of the combinations, the 21 minutes side, as minimal as it was for Ben Simmons and Spencer Dinwiddie, yeah, it was 122, 113 splits. That's excellent. That's everything you want it to be, right? But there aren't a lot of those examples. The Spencer Dinwiddie-Mikal Bridges combination, by the way, was ultimately successful. We talked about this, 734 minutes, a 116, 112. And that comes blended in with other guys. But that's a nice encapsulation, the post-trade era, where you solely know there's no Kevin Durant being factored into this, right? No Kyrie Irving. And we do our best to eliminate those guys when it's someone who existed, like a Cam Thomas, from the first half of the season to the back half, right? So all these different combinations and veteran experience and youth possibilities are the reasons why you have to be willing to take the quote-unquote chance that if Cam Thomas is inserted into the starting five with Ben Simmons, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and Nick Claxton, you could actually be a very solid offensive unit. You could be a top half offense unit. I don't know if that's the team if you don't include the potential of Cam Thomas. I don't know if that's achievable from Spencer Dinwiddie. And the easiest way to frame this would be that Spencer Dinwiddie, when we go back and think about his stats, we understand he comes over and he's a 16-point scorer for the Brooklyn Nets. He was almost an 18-point scorer with Dallas. Cam Thomas can be a 20-point scorer. Spencer Dinwiddie only once in his career, going back to 2019-20, where he started 49 games and played 31 minutes and gave you almost 21 points, right? That's the only time he's ever done that. The one thing that you like about his last couple of years, Spencer Dinwiddie, is that actually last year, with Dallas and then coming over, was that the free throw shooting also got up there. And he was getting 4 and 5 trips to the line, right? Both these players, Cam Thomas and Spencer Dinwiddie, have very similar qualities to their game. The only difference is Spencer Dinwiddie's ceiling is defined. Cam Thomas's is not. And that means that with Spencer Dinwiddie in the starting lineup and the impact of Ben Simmons' return, there will be a ceiling at, and putting Cam Thomas in means you elevate that. Maybe the floor gets a little bit lower. That's entirely possible, but the ceiling raises. And if you're the Brooklyn Nets and you believe that you can look at this roster and look at this upcoming season and look at the Eastern Conference and say, we believe that we are somewhat comfortably entrenched into the play-in tournament, yes, and maybe even staying clear of that play-in tournament with 100% Ben Simmons healthy, then you can afford to take a mild risk early, put Cam Thomas in, see if he's ready for that role, and make adjustments off of that. Because don't forget, Spencer Dinwiddie, Royce O'Neal, and Dorian Finney-Smith may not even be on this roster by the end of the year. So you want to waste potentially 20 games of these guys getting rhythm and reps together, Cam Thomas and Ben Simmons and Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson and Nicholas Claxton? You want to isolate Cam Thomas down to a 10 to 15 minute role coming off the bench rather than being a 20 to 25 minute starter, which we didn't even get into, right? You don't have to max him out at 35 minutes. You can put him in the starting unit and look for that instant high-powered offense right out of the gates. Play him 20 to 25 minutes this year. Give him a not dissimilar treatment to Nicholas Claxton as he developed over the years. We know that Cam Thomas has not played max minutes in recent seasons, and we know that when he's played big minutes, it's really been, the overall average for this season gets muddled by the fact that he would play big stretches and have really big minute totals and play 40 plus and then not play at all for weeks, right? He started 67 games in his rookie year, started just 17.6 minutes. Not consistently, but that was the average. 16.6 this past season was 57 games and 4 starts. So go and take him up to 20 to 25 minutes and give that to him consistently as he was a starter all through his collegiate career. Let him have that rhythm night over night and see what you have in him. Know what you have in him, and then project forward how in the short term he's a member of the starting unit. And in the long term, if Ben Simmons suddenly pans out and you're going to keep him around beyond this contract at a much more team-friendly number, Well, Ben Simmons is just 25, 26 years old. He's going to be 27 years old. He can fit into that wheelhouse with other players potentially. You maybe can extend the window of what Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson for the Brooklyn Nets look like. But you don't get there without figuring out where you are now. And I'd just be gravely disappointed if the first 20 to 30 games of the upcoming season is all about the veterans getting too much playing time and the young talent not getting the minutes that they deserve and that the organization needs to give them so that they accurately define who stays, who goes, who has the role, who's getting paid. These are questions that have to be answered, all while still wanting to be a consistent team, a playoff team. Understood. They can serve both agendas in this regard, and maybe Cam Thomas is that answer. Bottom line is, we'll continue this discussion all throughout the offseason. Doug and I will probably circle back to this and butt heads about the case for and against Spencer or Cam being in the starting five. But there's all the rest of this bench unit that we can get into deeper here. The training camp, the preseason game are going to matter greatly for how we look at this Nets roster and get some real defined ideas of what roles are, especially when it comes to Smith Jr., Alani Walker. The minutes in preseason are going to tell you the story about a lot of these guys. So we'll be breaking that down as we move along and really head towards mid-October. It's not that far away, right? We're a little over a couple weeks away from getting real NBA basketball as well. So we won't have to debate or speculate. We'll just get the answers right in front of us. The way that you get the answers right in front of you is to get over to YouTube, subscribe to the Locked On Nets channel, wherever you also get your podcast needs fulfilled. Over on Twitter, at Doug Norrie, at Adam Arbrecht, at Locked On Nets. And as we always say, when there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend. I can't wait until he is back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.